Richard Coleman, a man who had seen it all in the competitive world of fine dining, walked into his own establishment with a rare sense of anonymity. Tonight, he wanted to be just another diner, not the powerful owner or the critic everyone wanted to impress. He simply wished to experience his own restaurant as his guests did, without the polished performance that greeted him whenever he visited openly. The warm ambience of the restaurant, with its dim lights and soft jazz, felt welcoming as he slid into a secluded corner. A waiter approached with the evening specials, and Richard chose the handmade pasta, a dish he had insisted be perfected down to the last detail. After ordering, he leaned back, ready to critique every flavor, every texture. What he didn't expect, however, was the intensity of the taste when he took his first bite. The pasta was exquisite, even better than he'd imagined. The sauce was balanced, the pasta perfectly al dente, and there was a subtle undertone he couldn't quite place. It was like tasting a memory, something familiar yet impossible to recall. He found himself savoring each bite, trying to figure out what made it so unique. Once he finished, he couldn't resist. "Excuse me," he called to his waiter as the young man cleared the plates. "Who's the chef tonight?" This dish was remarkable. The waiter, slightly taken aback by the intense interest, replied, "Her name is Sarah, sir. She just joined the team a few months ago and has been experimenting with the menu. Would you like to meet her?" Without a second thought, Richard nodded. As he was led through the maze of tables and into the kitchen, he wondered who this chef was. In all his years of experience, few dishes had left him genuinely curious. The kitchen was alive with the hum of activity. Pots clanging, chefs shouting orders, the unmistakable scent of caramelizing onions and roasting herbs filling the air. And there, among the bustle, was Sarah. She was younger than he expected, with a focused intensity in her eyes as she garnished a dish, her movements swift and precise. As Richard approached, Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze with a brief, polite smile. But something flickered in her expression, a flash of recognition or maybe confusion. Richard couldn't tell. She wiped her hands on a towel and stepped forward, her curiosity matching his. "Mr. Coleman," she greeted him, her voice steady, but her eyes studied him carefully. "I'm glad you enjoyed the pasta." Richard was momentarily lost for words, an unusual state for him. There was something about her face, her stance, that triggered an emotion he couldn't quite place. He found himself staring longer than he should have. "It was incredible," he managed to say, snapping back to himself. "It's been a while since a dish surprised me. What inspired you?" Sarah glanced down for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It's a family recipe," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been working on it for years, trying to recreate it just right. A family recipe." That phrase echoed in Richard's mind as he watched her, sensing something deeper beneath her answer. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a strange urge to learn more about her. The evening that had begun as a casual visit to his restaurant was now steeped in an inexplicable mystery, one that lingered as he returned to his table, his mind swirling with questions he had never expected to ask. Back at his table, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over him after meeting Sarah. He'd been in the restaurant business for years, and while he had encountered his fair share of talented chefs, none had stirred such a deep sense of familiarity. But why? He racked his mind for answers, struggling to recall if he had ever seen her before. There was a faint glimmer of recognition, yet every time he tried to focus on it, it slipped away, like an image fading in and out. With every minute that passed, his curiosity grew. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in coincidences. He trusted his instincts, and something in him screamed that there was more to this chef than met the eye. He watched the other diners chatting and laughing, oblivious to the strange conflict that had taken hold of him. The joyful atmosphere only made his own discomfort stand out more. Finally, he stood, his mind made up. He couldn't just walk away from this feeling without understanding it better. Steeling himself, he headed back to the kitchen, pushing past the swinging door. There, Sarah was still in her element, focused on a dessert plate she was assembling. When she looked up and saw him return, her brow furrowed slightly, her expression flickering with surprise. "Mr. Coleman?" she asked, clearly unsure why he had come back. He hesitated, then decided to be direct. Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have we met before? Sarah paused, as if caught off guard by his question. She took a quick breath, eyes darting away before looking back at him. I don't think so, she said, but her voice held a slight tremor. I mean, I don't believe we've ever crossed paths. Richard noted the way she answered, almost too carefully, and something about it only deepened his suspicion. Are you sure? He pressed gently, trying to gauge her reaction. It's strange, but I felt something familiar when I saw you. Sarah's hand clenched the edge of the counter, just barely noticeable, but Richard caught it. Her eyes softened, and she looked at him more closely, as if she, too, was searching for answers. Sometimes people remind us of others, she said, her tone distant, as though the words came from somewhere else entirely. It's probably nothing, but Richard wasn't convinced. Where are you from, Sarah? He asked, steering the conversation in a different direction. Perhaps if he learned more about her background, he could understand why she triggered this unusual feeling. Originally, she asked, meeting his gaze with a hint of defiance. A small town in Oregon. I grew up there, for a little while at least. For a little while? Richard pressed, sensing a story behind her words. He didn't know if he was being too forward, but something told him not to let this conversation go. Sarah hesitated again, as though deciding how much to reveal. I was adopted when I was young, she said slowly. After my parents, well, I don't really remember them. I was too little. There was a rawness in her voice, a vulnerability that made Richard's chest tighten. For a brief moment, he felt an ache, one he had long buried, yet which seemed to resurface with Sarah's words. It took all his composure to keep his expression steady. I'm sorry to hear that, he said quietly, his voice unexpectedly soft. He could see she was uncomfortable, yet he sensed she wasn't as closed off as she appeared. I don't mean to pry, but I lost someone too, a long time ago. My daughter. Sarah's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Her lips parted as if to say something, but she hesitated, looking away. Richard wondered if he had crossed a line, but before he could apologize, she turned back to him, her gaze steady. It must have been hard, she said finally, her voice softer, almost empathetic. Losing a child. Richard nodded, feeling the years-old grief press on him as he spoke. Yes, it was. I tried to move on, but some losses you carry with you. He cleared his throat, trying to dispel the tension. But anyway, I apologize for bringing it up. I didn't mean to make things heavy. Sarah managed a faint smile, though her eyes held a sadness he couldn't quite understand. It's all right, Mr. Coleman. Sometimes sharing makes things easier. As he stood there, studying her face, the faintest suspicion began to take root in his mind. He dismissed it as quickly as it came. The idea was too outlandish, too impossible. Yet, that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him, lingering like a ghost he couldn't shake. Thank you for your time, Sarah, he said, deciding it was best to step back for now. And for an incredible meal. Sarah nodded, her face unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I'm glad you enjoyed it. As he walked out of the kitchen, he knew he would be back. He would find out who she was, or, perhaps more importantly, why she had stirred something in him he thought he had buried for good. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt the uneasy thrill of something unknown on the horizon. That night, Richard could barely sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every detail of his interaction with Sarah. Her voice, the way she'd spoken of her family, the flicker of recognition that seemed to spark in her eyes when he mentioned his daughter. It all swirled together, forming a picture he couldn't quite decipher. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, he dreamed of the accident. It had been years ago, but his mind seemed determined to pull him back to that day. The sirens, the frantic calls to the hospital, the way his life had shifted, split into a clear before and after. He'd been told there were no survivors, and for years he had buried that part of his life. But now, with Sarah's face imprinted in his memory, he felt the wound reopen. The next morning, Richard woke early, determined to find out more. He felt both foolish and desperate, two emotions he hated. But something in him couldn't let this go. He dressed quickly, making up his mind as he did. He would return to the restaurant under the pretense of checking on business, but in reality, he intended to see Sarah again. When he arrived, the restaurant staff was already setting up for the day, preparing tables and going over the reservations list. His manager, Tony, looked up in surprise when he saw Richard enter. "Mr. Coleman," Tony greeted him, standing a little straighter. "Good to see you. Everything all right?" Richard forced a casual tone. "Just checking in. Thought I'd see how the team's doing." He hesitated, then added as nonchalantly as he could, "I met the new chef last night, Sarah. Talented, isn't she?" Tony nodded, his expression brightening. "Oh, absolutely. She's incredible. Brings something new to the menu every week. Guests are starting to ask for her dishes by name." Richard felt a strange sense of pride mixed with apprehension. "Does she ever talk about her past?" he asked, trying to keep the question light, as if it were just casual curiosity. "Her inspirations for cooking, where she learned her skills?" Tony shrugged. "Not really, no. I mean, I know she came from Oregon. She doesn't talk about her personal life much, but she's a hard worker. Shows up early, stays late, never complains." "Why do you ask?" Richard shook his head, as if dismissing his own question. "No reason. Just, she seemed familiar to me, that's all." Satisfied with the answer, Tony excused himself to resume preparations, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He knew he couldn't just leave it at that. He needed more. Without overthinking it, he decided to approach the matter more directly. Moving to the kitchen, he scanned the bustling space, his gaze landing on Sarah as she meticulously arranged ingredients on a cutting board. She worked with an almost reverent focus, her movements precise and practiced. When she sensed his presence, she glanced up, surprise flashing in her eyes. "Mr. Coleman," she said, a hint of caution in her tone. "Back so soon?" Richard offered a small smile, hoping to ease the tension. "I wanted to ask you something, Sarah. I apologize if it's intrusive, but I can't ignore this feeling I have." He took a breath, steadying himself. "How long have you been in this city?" Sarah looked taken aback, but she answered, "I moved here about a year ago. Before that, I was traveling, learning different styles of cooking." His brow furrowed. "So, you've never lived here before?" She shook her head, appearing slightly confused. "No, not before now." "Why?" Richard hesitated, suddenly unsure how much he wanted to reveal. He took a step back, considering how to phrase what he wanted to say without alarming her. "Forgive me. This is going to sound unusual, but I lost my daughter many years ago. I don't know why, but something about meeting you stirred memories of her. I can't help feeling there's a connection." Sarah's face softened, and she seemed to search his eyes, as though weighing her own response. "I don't know what to say, Mr. Coleman. I'm sorry for your loss. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." Her sympathy was genuine, yet her tone held a trace of something he couldn't define. She was calm, almost too calm, and Richard couldn't shake the suspicion gnawing at him. "I don't mean to pry," he continued, determined now to get answers, "but you mentioned you were adopted. Do you know anything about your birth family?" At that, Sarah's face tightened, and a flicker of discomfort passed over her expression. She glanced down, avoiding his gaze as she took a moment to answer. "No, not really," she said slowly. "My adoptive parents told me there was an accident, but they never shared details. I never asked." Richard's heart raced. This was too much of a coincidence. His mind whirled with the possibilities, with the hope he knew could shatter him if he dared to believe it. He couldn't stop now. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you be willing to maybe look into it? Your background, I mean." She looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice, and for a moment, she seemed to consider it. But then, a guarded look replaced the softness in her eyes, and she took a step back. "I don't know, Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice steady but her tone distant. "I appreciate your interest, but I've made peace with my past. I'm not looking to bring up old memories." Her words felt like a door slamming shut. Richard took a breath, trying to keep his disappointment from showing. "Of course, I understand, he replied, though the words sounded hollow even to him. She nodded, her expression polite but firm. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I hope you have a good day. As she turned back to her work, Richard stood there, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. The hope he'd felt was slipping away, leaving a hollow ache. But as he walked out of the kitchen, a thought lingered in his mind. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. In the days that followed, Richard found himself increasingly distracted, unable to focus on his work or the steady rhythm of his routine. Every task, no matter how pressing, felt distant compared to the questions gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the strange connection he felt to Sarah, and her reluctance to speak about her past only fueled his determination. Deep down, he sensed there was more to her story, perhaps something even she wasn't aware of. He began to wonder if she, too, might feel the same strange familiarity that he did, but was simply choosing to ignore it. Unable to leave it alone, he decided to act quietly, without her knowledge. He called an old friend, a private investigator he'd worked with years ago on a delicate business matter. The investigator, Mark, was known for his discretion and thoroughness, exactly what Richard needed. Mark, Richard began, his tone low and serious as they spoke over the phone. I need you to look into someone's background for me. Discreetly. Her name's Sarah, and she works as a chef at one of my restaurants. I don't have a last name for you, but I know she's originally from Oregon and was adopted as a child. I need to know if there's any connection to me. I know it sounds strange, but trust me on this. Mark paused on the other end of the line, absorbing the unusual request. You think she might be someone from your past? He asked, his voice reflecting both curiosity and caution. Richard hesitated, almost reluctant to voice his hope. Maybe. Just see what you can find. I'll be careful, Mark replied, his tone professional. I'll look into it and get back to you as soon as I find anything. Hanging up the phone, Richard felt a surge of both relief and trepidation. He had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. He knew that if Mark found nothing, he'd have to accept the painful truth that Sarah was simply a stranger. But if there was something, even the faintest connection, he would know he wasn't losing his mind. Days turned into a week, and each day that passed felt slower than the last. Richard continued to visit the restaurant, carefully avoiding direct interaction with Sarah, yet his eyes seemed to find her without effort. She moved through the kitchen with her usual grace and focus, her attention completely absorbed in her craft. Watching her reminded him of his late wife, of the quiet intensity she possessed, a trait their daughter had shared. That memory only deepened his conviction, adding to the complex storm of emotions swirling inside him. Finally, one evening, just as he was about to close his office for the night, his phone rang. It was Mark. Heart pounding, Richard answered. Richard, Mark began, his tone cautious. I found some things. I'm not sure what you're hoping for, but there are a few details that stood out. Enough that you might want to sit down for this. Richard lowered himself into his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Go ahead. Mark exhaled on the other end, gathering his thoughts. First off, Sarah was indeed adopted as a child. She was taken in by a couple in Oregon, but here's where it gets interesting. The adoption was finalized only after a significant delay. From what I gathered, it took over a year to sort out her paperwork, which is unusual. And in the documents, there's a reference to a possible family connection in New York. The agency couldn't locate the parents, but, he paused, allowing Richard to process the implications. A family connection in New York. Richard's pulse quickened. He'd lived in New York for most of his life, as had his late wife and daughter. And her birth parents? Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. That's the strange part. The records are sealed, Mark replied. That typically only happens in cases involving a tragedy or when the biological parents requested it for privacy reasons. Richard's mind reeled, his thoughts racing. His daughter's accident had been in New York, and if Sarah's adoption had involved records that were sealed, there was no denying it. His hope was growing, and with it, a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. So, you think? Richard couldn't finish the question. The possibility was too overwhelming. I don't know, Richard, Mark admitted, his tone careful. It's all speculation at this point. but I can keep digging. If you want, I can contact the adoption agency in Oregon, see if they're willing to share any additional information under the right circumstances. Yes, Richard replied immediately, his voice steadier than he felt. Do whatever you have to. Just find out everything you can. Hanging up, he sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights outside his window, feeling a rare mix of hope and dread. What if he was wrong, and this was all a painful mistake? But what if he wasn't? What if Sarah was his daughter? The days that followed were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and silent anticipation as he waited for Mark's call. The restaurant visits became harder. Every time he saw Sarah, he felt the overwhelming urge to tell her, to ask her directly if she had ever wondered about her birth family. But he restrained himself, knowing that without proof, he risked hurting them both. A week later, Mark finally called him back. Richard could tell from his friend's tone that the news was important. They agreed to meet in person, at a quiet cafe where they wouldn't be disturbed. Richard arrived early, his nerves taut as he sipped his coffee, replaying every detail in his mind. When Mark arrived, he took a seat across from Richard and handed him a manila folder. This is everything I could gather. It's not conclusive, but it's compelling. With trembling hands, Richard opened the folder, scanning the documents. There were photocopies of Sarah's adoption records, reports from the agency, and a few handwritten notes from interviews Mark had conducted. And then he saw it, a mention of a specific date that sent a jolt through him. That's the same year, Richard said quietly, barely able to control the quiver in his voice. That's the year she would have been born. Mark nodded, his expression both sympathetic and grave. It's a match with your daughter's birth year. But without a DNA test, we can't be certain. Richard took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. He would have to find a way to ask Sarah, without frightening her, without ruining everything. The road ahead would be delicate, and he'd have to tread carefully. But as he sat there, clutching the folder, he knew one thing for sure. He would find the truth, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Richard grew more and more determined to reach out to Sarah. He had the documents, the hints of her background, and now the near certainty in his heart that she was his daughter. But approaching her wasn't going to be easy. He knew that if he came on too strong, she might shut him out completely. She'd already been guarded the last time they spoke, and he worried that pressing her too hard could push her further away. After much thought, he decided he'd try a softer approach, easing his way into her life through casual, non-threatening conversations. It was the only way he could think to build trust. He'd spent years honing his negotiation skills, reading people, finding ways to connect, but he never thought he'd need those skills for something so personal, so fragile. This was different. This was his daughter, or could be, and he knew he only had one chance to get it right. One evening, as the kitchen was winding down, he noticed Sarah standing alone by the back door, taking a moment for herself. She looked exhausted but peaceful, her face softened in the dim evening light. Richard approached quietly, making sure not to startle her. "Long day?" he asked gently, leaning against the wall nearby. She looked over, a small, weary smile crossing her face. "Feels like they all are lately, but it's good, you know? I like being busy." He nodded, watching her closely, seeing hints of someone he remembered. It was in her small gestures, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, the subtle tilt of her head. It was uncanny, and each small detail filled him with hope. "You know, I used to have a similar work ethic," he said, attempting a light tone. "I built this place from the ground up because I believed in what I was creating. I guess I see a lot of that in you." She looked at him, surprised but appreciative, though she quickly looked down, as if uncomfortable with the compliment. "Thank you. That means a lot," she said quietly. He decided to take a chance, to open up a little more in hopes she'd feel comfortable enough to do the same. "I used to dream about running a place like this with my family someday," he continued. "My wife, my daughter. I always thought we'd work side by side." Sarah's expression shifted, a flicker of emotion passing over her face that he couldn't quite read. "What happened?" she asked, her voice softer now. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years' worth of pain rise to the surface. "We lost her," he said, barely able to keep his voice steady. It was an accident. A horrible one. I was told there were no survivors. He paused, then added, but sometimes I wonder if maybe they were wrong. The words hung between them, thick with meaning, and Richard could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he expected her reaction to be, but he watched her intently, hoping to see some sign that she understood. Sarah looked away, biting her lip, and for a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I've always wondered about my own family," she admitted, staring down at the ground. "I don't know anything about them, really. Just that something happened. My adoptive parents told me I was found alone after an accident, but they didn't know the details." Richard's heart clenched as he listened. He felt both fear and hope intertwine, stronger than ever. He took a cautious step closer, his voice gentle. "Sarah, I know this might sound impossible, but would you ever consider looking into it? Maybe together we could find out if—" "Mr. Coleman," she interrupted, her voice suddenly firmer, yet it trembled slightly. She looked up, meeting his gaze with an intensity that startled him. It's a lot to take in. I've lived my whole life not knowing, and I've made peace with it. I never expected someone to come looking for me." He searched her face, seeing the conflict there, the hesitation mixed with curiosity. He could tell that some part of her was drawn to the idea, even if it scared her. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't want to overwhelm you, but maybe we could start small. Just a few questions, a little digging, and if it doesn't feel right, you can walk away." "I'll respect that." She seemed to consider this, her gaze dropping as she mulled it over. Her fingers fiddled nervously with the hem of her apron, a small gesture he recognized from his daughter's childhood, a telltale sign that she was nervous. It took everything in him not to reach out and hold her, to reassure her that she wasn't alone in this, that he would support her no matter what. "Maybe," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not making any promises. That's all I ask," he replied, his relief palpable. "Just a chance." They stood in silence for a moment, both absorbing the gravity of the conversation. Richard could feel his heart racing, aware that he was closer than ever to the truth, yet still standing on fragile ground. He couldn't afford to push her, not now. "I'll let you get back," he said after a long pause, giving her a small nod of reassurance. "Thank you, Sarah, for trusting me with this." She gave a faint smile, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "Good night, Mr. Coleman." He watched as she slipped back into the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. The moment left him breathless, his thoughts racing. They were on the edge of something life-changing, and he knew he'd need to tread carefully. But for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of healing, of finally reuniting with the daughter he thought he'd lost forever. The following week unfolded with a quiet tension that both Richard and Sarah felt but didn't speak about. Every time he visited the restaurant, Richard could sense the unspoken weight between them, as if they were both tiptoeing around the delicate possibility that had yet to fully take shape. Sarah worked as tirelessly as ever, but now her glances were more guarded, her responses tinged with hesitation. Richard knew she was struggling with her own questions, her own fears, and he tried his best to respect her pace, keeping his distance when he sensed she needed space. But one evening, as the restaurant was winding down, Sarah approached him unexpectedly, catching him just as he was about to leave. "Mr. Coleman, can I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, her voice unusually soft, her eyes wary but determined. "Of course, Sarah," he replied, feeling his pulse quicken. He followed her to a quiet corner of the restaurant, away from the remaining staff and late-night diners. Once they were alone, she took a deep breath, visibly steeling herself. "I've been thinking about what you said, about us looking into my past." Richard nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation. He kept his expression calm, even as his mind raced with hope. "Take all the time you need, Sarah," he said gently. "I know this isn't easy." She looked down, her hands twisting together as she struggled to find the words. "I'm not saying I believe it, that you could be my father," she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I guess I want to know the truth." Whatever that truth is, Richard exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. That's all I want too. No assumptions, no pressure. Just the truth. He paused, measuring his words. If you're comfortable with it, we could start with something small. A DNA test, maybe. Something straightforward, with clear answers. She hesitated, the mention of a DNA test seeming to unsettle her. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted, glancing away. I've lived my whole life without knowing. What if we find out something neither of us wants to hear? He understood her fear. He'd wrestled with the same thoughts. The possibility that he was wrong, that he might have built up hope around a stranger. But he also knew that the questions would haunt them both if they didn't confront them. I can't pretend to know what you're feeling, Sarah, he said gently. But whatever the truth is, I'd rather face it than keep wondering. If we're wrong, then we walk away. But if we're right, it could change everything. She was silent for a long time, her gaze drifting to the empty tables and dim lights around them, as if searching for answers in the quiet of the restaurant. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Okay, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Let's do it. Let's do the test. A mixture of relief and nerves surged through Richard, but he kept his voice calm. Thank you, Sarah. You don't know how much this means to me. They arranged to meet at a clinic later that week. He could see the anxiety in her eyes, the way she seemed to withdraw into herself, but she met his gaze steadily, as though determined to see it through. When they finally parted that evening, Richard felt both hopeful and terrified. He had waited years for this moment, and now the truth was within reach. But what would that truth bring? The day of the test arrived faster than either of them expected. They met at a discreet clinic downtown, the sterile walls and clinical lighting adding to the tension between them. Sarah was quiet, her face pale and tense as they waited in the small room, the air thick with anticipation. Richard wanted to reach out, to offer her some kind of comfort, but he held back, sensing that she needed her space. The nurse entered with the test kits, explaining the simple procedure. Sarah went first, her hands visibly shaking as she held the swab, glancing over at Richard with a nervous smile. He gave her an encouraging nod, and she took a breath before completing the test. When it was his turn, Richard felt a similar rush of nerves, the reality of the moment sinking in as he held the swab. This test would either confirm his deepest hope or close the door on it forever. When it was done, they handed over the samples, and the nurse informed them that the results would be ready within a few days. Richard thanked her, then turned to Sarah, seeing the relief and exhaustion etched on her face. They walked out of the clinic together, silent as they stepped onto the busy sidewalk. Thank you for doing this, Richard said, breaking the silence as they lingered near the entrance. I know it wasn't easy. She gave him a small, tired smile. I guess. I needed to know, too. No matter what it turns out to be. They stood there, both uncertain, both waiting for a conclusion they couldn't yet see. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat, her gaze shifting to the street. I'll see you at work, she murmured, nodding to him before turning and walking away, blending into the crowd as though she were trying to escape the enormity of what they'd just done. Richard watched her go, a mixture of hope and dread swirling in his chest. He knew the coming days would be some of the longest of his life. The wait for the test results felt endless. Every day, Richard found himself checking his phone, hoping for some notification, some call that would bring either closure or an entirely new beginning. He felt a sense of anticipation that made it hard to focus on anything else. Work became a distraction, something to keep his mind from wandering into endless what-ifs, but he couldn't avoid the thoughts that crept in, especially late at night, when he lay awake, imagining a life he'd thought lost forever. For Sarah, the waiting was just as heavy, though she kept her emotions buried beneath layers of cautious reserve. She showed up at the restaurant each day, performing her duties with the same dedication as always, yet Richard noticed the subtle changes. She was quieter, more introspective, and he occasionally caught her staring off into the distance, her brow furrowed, as if she too were bracing herself for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted. Then, one late afternoon, as the restaurant was winding down after the lunch rush, Richard's phone finally rang. His heart leaped, and he stepped outside to answer, his hands trembling as he brought the phone to his ear. "Mr. Coleman? This is the clinic," the voice on the other end said. "The results are in." Richard took a breath, steadying himself, and there was a pause, and then, finally, the answer. "The test confirms a biological relationship. Sarah is your daughter." The words sank in slowly, as if his mind were struggling to process what they truly meant. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His voice caught somewhere between shock and overwhelming relief. He gripped the phone tightly, feeling a surge of emotion that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick. "Thank you so much." As he hung up, he stood there on the sidewalk, the city sounds fading into the background, his thoughts consumed by the single, undeniable truth. Sarah was his daughter. She was alive, standing on the other side of a door just steps away, and he could hardly believe it. After taking a few steadying breaths, he walked back inside. He knew he couldn't delay this conversation. Not now. He made his way to the kitchen, where he found Sarah cleaning up her station, her face thoughtful, lost in her own world. When she saw him approach, her expression shifted, a flicker of tension crossing her face. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but filled with a gravity that made her straighten, her gaze searching his. "Can we talk? Privately?" She glanced around, then nodded, wiping her hands and following him out of the bustling kitchen to a quiet corner of the dining area, where they could speak without interruption. The air between them felt charged, as if they both knew that something important was about to be said. Once they were seated, Richard took a deep breath, meeting her gaze with an intensity that seemed to surprise her. "I got the results," he began, his voice barely steady. "The DNA test." Sarah held her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. He could see the apprehension in her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed, bracing for whatever he was about to say. "It's positive, Sarah," he said softly. "You're my daughter." The words hung in the air, echoing between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Richard could see the shock in her expression, the disbelief mingling with something deeper, something raw and vulnerable. She looked away, blinking rapidly, as if trying to process the truth that had just been laid before her. I don't," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down at her hands, which had begun to shake. "All this time, I didn't know. I didn't think." Richard reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers, feeling the tremor in her fingers. "Neither did I. I thought I'd lost you forever," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And now, here you are. I don't even know how to begin to express what this means to me." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, pain, and the first hint of recognition. "It feels unreal," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I spent my whole life wondering, never knowing if I'd find them, my real parents. And now you're here." He nodded, feeling a swell of emotions he could hardly contain. "Sarah, I can't imagine what this must feel like for you. It's overwhelming for me too. I don't expect you to just accept this all at once, but I want you to know, I'm here, and I'll be here as long as you need." She pulled her hand back, folding her arms across her chest protectively, her gaze distant. "I don't know what to feel. My whole life, I thought my story was closed, that I'd never know the truth." She looked down, her brow furrowed, as though wrestling with emotions she didn't fully understand. "How am I supposed to feel, knowing I was lost? That no one came looking?" Richard felt a pang of guilt, a familiar ache that he had carried for years. He wanted to tell her everything, the accident, the endless nights of grief, the years of believing there was no hope. But he knew he couldn't rush this. She needed time, and he had to respect that. "I know I can't undo the past, and I can't change the years we lost," he said, his voice filled with quiet regret. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to get to know you now. I want to be part of your life, in whatever way you're comfortable with." She looked away, clearly overwhelmed, her expression guarded yet filled with a depth of emotion that he could almost feel himself. "I don't know what I'm comfortable with," she admitted. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Richard reached out again, but this time he stopped short, allowing his hand to hover close to hers without touching. Then let's take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just one day at a time. She finally looked at him, her eyes softening slightly, though there was still an undeniable pain there. I think I need time to process this, she said quietly. It's too much all at once. Of course, he replied, nodding. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. They sat there in silence, the enormity of the moment settling over them. Richard could feel the weight of both grief and hope mingling in his heart, a bittersweet blend of everything he'd dreamed of and everything he'd feared. He knew this journey was far from over. It would take time to heal, to build a relationship from the pieces of the past they'd both carried. After a while, Sarah stood, her expression resolute but uncertain. Thank you for finding me, she said softly, her voice thick with a vulnerability he had never seen before. She hesitated, then gave him a small, tentative smile before turning and walking away. As he watched her go, Richard felt a glimmer of hope settle within him. She hadn't embraced him or declared him her father, but she had left him with a possibility, a chance that he'd never thought he'd have. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Richard and Sarah began to navigate the fragile, uncertain path of reconnection. Their meetings were brief and cautious, like two people circling around a delicate, precious thing they didn't yet know how to hold. Richard approached each encounter with careful patience, holding back the immense desire he had to tell her everything, the memories he'd held onto, the questions that had haunted him. Instead, he let Sarah lead, offering gentle conversation, waiting for her to feel safe enough to open up on her own. Sarah, in turn, seemed to be working through a storm of emotions she couldn't quite hide. At work, she was as focused and dedicated as ever, but there were moments when Richard would catch her looking at him, her gaze filled with unspoken questions. She was trying to make sense of it all, he knew, and the process seemed to exhaust her. She looked as though she was balancing on the edge of something she didn't yet know how to accept. One evening, after the restaurant had closed and the last of the staff had gone, Sarah lingered in the dining room, wiping down tables with slow, almost absent-minded movements. Richard was locking up his office when he noticed her there, alone, and decided to approach. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft so as not to startle her. She looked up, managing a faint smile. "They all feel long these days," she replied, her tone tired but not unkind. She continued wiping the table, though it was already clean, her gaze distant. Richard took a seat at a nearby table, watching her with gentle curiosity. "I know this has been a lot to process," he began carefully, "and I want you to know that I'm here to listen. If there's ever anything you want to ask, or if you just need to talk." Sarah hesitated, her hands pausing on the table as she considered his words. She looked at him, her expression guarded yet vulnerable, as if she were weighing something important. "Actually, there is something I've been wanting to ask," she admitted, her voice hesitant. I didn't know if I should." "Anything," Richard said, leaning forward, his heart pounding with both anticipation and hope. "Whatever it is, you can ask." She took a breath, then looked away, her gaze fixed on a distant point as she gathered her thoughts. I just want to know what happened. To you. To us. Why didn't you find me sooner?" Her words were raw, laced with pain and confusion, and Richard felt a pang of guilt that went straight to his core. He'd wondered himself, countless times, what he could have done differently, whether he could have somehow changed the outcome. But he knew he couldn't hide the truth from her. She deserved honesty, even if it hurt. "There was an accident," he began slowly, his voice low as he relived that painful day in his mind. "You were very young, just a child. Your mother and we were told there were no survivors, that no one could have survived." He swallowed, the memory still sharp, even after all these years. "I believe them, Sarah. I thought I'd lost you." She listened in silence, her gaze fixed on the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the surface as she absorbed his words. "I tried to move on," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But you were always there, a part of me that I couldn't let go of. And then, when I saw you that night at the restaurant, Something in me recognized you. I didn't know how or why, but I couldn't shake the feeling. And then everything started to fall into place. Sarah's eyes glistened as she looked up, her face a mix of anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite place. "So all these years, you didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He shook his head, feeling the weight of her pain as though it were his own. "I had no idea. If I'd known. If there was even a hint that you were alive, I would have searched every corner of this earth to find you." Her face softened, though the sadness in her eyes remained. I thought maybe I wasn't wanted," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "Growing up, I had this feeling that I didn't belong. My adoptive parents were good people, but it was never. I always felt like something was missing." Richard's heart broke at her words, the guilt he carried deepening. "You were wanted, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know. Not a day went by that I didn't think of you. Wonder who you would have become. I would have done anything to keep you if I could." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Finally, Sarah looked at him, her expression softer, as if a wall between them had begun to crack. "It's strange," she murmured, her gaze distant. "All this time, I thought I'd made peace with my past, that I didn't need to know. But now I don't know what to think anymore." Richard nodded, understanding all too well. "I feel the same way. I thought I'd buried the past, that I'd moved on. But now, knowing you're here, everything has changed." They shared a quiet moment, both grappling with the enormity of what lay before them. Richard knew he couldn't rush her, couldn't force her to accept him as her father. She had to find her own way, her own path to healing, and he had to respect that. "Would it be all right if we spent some time together?" he asked tentatively. "Outside of work, I mean. Maybe we could, I don't know, start to get to know each other. Not as strangers, but as family." She looked down, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her apron. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of letting him in. Yet there was a spark of curiosity too, a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could bridge the gap between them. "Maybe," she replied quietly, almost to herself. "It could be nice to see what it's like." Richard smiled, relief flooding through him. He reached out, letting his hand rest on the table between them, an unspoken offer of support. "No expectations," he promised, his voice warm. "Just time." She nodded, her expression softening. "Okay, we can try that." They sat together for a few more minutes, the silence between them comfortable, as if they were both finally allowing themselves to imagine what might come next. For Richard, it was a dream he'd never dared to hope for, a chance to know his daughter, to be a part of her life. And for Sarah, it was the beginning of a journey she had never expected, a chance to uncover pieces of herself that had always felt out of reach. When they finally stood to leave, Richard felt a calm he hadn't felt in years, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were on the path to healing. They walked out of the restaurant together, side by side, neither saying a word, but both feeling the quiet promise of a future they had only begun to imagine. Over the next several weeks, Richard and Sarah began to explore the fragile beginnings of a father-daughter relationship, though neither of them dared to call it that out loud. Their first outing together was tentative and careful, a simple breakfast at a small cafe where they could sit across from each other and talk about anything, or nothing, in a space that felt safe. They started with small talk, each of them cautious, as if learning the steps of a delicate dance. Richard asked about her favorite recipes, the dishes she loved to cook the most, and Sarah told him about her fascination with regional flavors, the subtle ways spices could bring out hidden textures in food. He listened intently, genuinely interested, his heart swelling with a sense of pride he had no right to feel. And yet, there it was. "Did you always know you wanted to cook?" he asked, carefully stirring his coffee, trying to keep his tone casual. Sarah thought for a moment, her expression softening as she searched for an answer. "Not always," she admitted. "It started out as a distraction, I think. Growing up, it was something I could control. I'd lose myself in the process, the rhythm of chopping vegetables, stirring sauces. It was calming. Then I realized I loved it, and it became more than a distraction. Richard nodded, understanding more than she knew. He, too, had once found solace in his work, building a restaurant from nothing, finding meaning and structure in the chaos of the kitchen. That makes sense, he said, a gentle warmth in his voice. Sometimes, it's the things we do to escape that end up becoming part of us. She looked at him, a glimmer of something like understanding in her eyes, and he felt that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to let him in. They didn't talk about the past, about the accident, or the years they'd missed, but he could feel those conversations hovering at the edge, waiting for the right moment. For now, it was enough just to be there, to share a meal together like they'd missed so many times before. After that first breakfast, they fell into a routine of seeing each other outside of the restaurant. They went for walks in the park, visited the occasional museum, and even took a cooking class together, where they worked side by side in the kitchen, laughing as they struggled to perfect a recipe for homemade pasta. Each meeting felt like a tiny piece of their connection falling into place, a patchwork of moments that, one by one, started to feel like family. But while Richard was cautiously optimistic, he could tell that Sarah was still holding back, as though afraid to let herself trust him fully. She laughed at his jokes, shared stories from her life, and listened to his memories. But there was always a slight distance, an invisible wall he could feel but couldn't cross. Then, one evening, Richard invited Sarah to his home for dinner. It was the first time she'd ever seen his personal space, and he could see the curiosity in her eyes as she looked around the modest but comfortable living room, taking in the shelves filled with books and photos, the small mementos from his life that he had never shared with anyone else. "Make yourself at home," he said, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. He had spent the entire day preparing the meal himself, choosing recipes that were both special and meaningful to him, hoping that the gesture would reach her in some way he couldn't put into words. As they ate, they fell into a natural rhythm, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had. They shared stories and laughed, and for the first time, Richard felt that the wall between them was starting to soften. After dinner, he brought out a photo album, one he hadn't looked at in years, one he hadn't planned to show her, but something in him knew the time had come. "I thought, maybe you'd like to see some photos," he said, his voice quiet as he placed the album on the table between them. Sarah looked down, her expression unreadable as she slowly opened the album, her fingers grazing the edges of the photos. The first few pages showed images of his younger self, grinning next to her mother, their faces filled with a youthful joy that now seemed almost unreal. As she turned the pages, her expression softened, a bittersweet look flickering in her eyes as she absorbed the pieces of a past she'd never known. Then, she reached the photos of herself as a baby. There she was, bundled in a pink blanket, her tiny face crinkling with laughter as Richard held her, his face filled with the unguarded love of a new father. Richard could see her jaw clench slightly as she looked at the images, the bittersweet realization that these memories existed without her. "I look so?" she began, but her voice faltered, her hand hovering over a picture of herself as a toddler, her chubby cheeks and wide eyes staring up at the camera. "Happy," Richard finished for her, his voice thick with emotion. You were a happy baby, Sarah." She nodded, swallowing hard as she continued to turn the pages. Each photo seemed to bring a new wave of emotions over her, memories she couldn't recall but that, in some way, belonged to her. When she finally reached the last page, she closed the album gently, as though it were something fragile. "Thank you for showing me," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I want you to know, Sarah, no matter what happened, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he thought she might pull away. But then, to his surprise, she squeezed his hand, holding onto it as though she were finally allowing herself to believe his words. "I believe you," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. It's hard to understand why it all happened. Why it had to be this way." He nodded, his own eyes misting as he struggled to keep his voice steady. "I don't have answers for that. I wish I did. But I'm here now, and I want to make up for the time we lost. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be there for your future. If you'll let me." She took a deep breath, looking down at their joined hands, her expression filled with a tentative hope. I think I'd like that," she replied, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "I'm not sure what it'll look like, or if I can ever feel completely okay with it, but I want to try." The relief and joy that filled Richard's heart was indescribable. For the first time, he felt that they were truly moving forward, that they were beginning to bridge the gap that years of separation had created. They sat in silence for a while, their hands still joined, each of them taking comfort in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. When Sarah finally stood to leave, Richard walked her to the door, feeling the bittersweet tug of parting but knowing that this time she would return. They exchanged a quiet goodbye, and as she turned to leave, she looked back, giving him a smile that was small but genuine. "Good night, Dad," she said, the words tentative but warm. It was the first time she'd ever called him that, and as he watched her walk away, Richard felt an overwhelming gratitude, a sense that, despite everything, they were on the path to healing. He closed the door, his heart full, ready to embrace whatever the future would bring them, one step at a time. Over the following months, Richard and Sarah continued to weave the delicate threads of a new relationship. They were no longer just two people bound by blood, but strangers navigating the layers of love, regret, and forgiveness. Their weekly meetings became an anchor for both of them, moments in which they shared pieces of their lives that had once been lost. Sarah started to open up about her childhood, her insecurities, and the struggles she'd faced growing up without knowing where she truly belonged. And Richard, in turn, shared stories from the years he spent grieving, filling in the gaps of all the missed milestones and memories. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the city, Richard invited Sarah to join him for dinner at a nearby restaurant he'd once helped design. It was one of his favorites, a cozy, quiet place with dim lighting and intimate booths. He wanted her to feel special, to experience a night that celebrated the distance they'd traveled together since that fateful first encounter. They arrived separately, and as they settled into their booth, Richard couldn't help but notice the way Sarah seemed more at ease. Her laughter came more readily, her eyes brighter, as if she, too, could feel the weight of their journey easing. After they'd ordered, Richard took a moment to look around, his gaze lingering on the elegant simplicity of the space. "This place reminds me of my dreams back when I first opened my own restaurant," he said, his voice warm with nostalgia. "I used to imagine sharing it with my family. I guess, in some ways, it's finally happening." Sarah smiled, her gaze softening. "I can see why you love it here. It feels comfortable, like a place that holds memories." He nodded, touched that she understood. "It does. And I think that's what makes it special. There's history here." They fell into easy conversation, discussing everything from new dishes Sarah was experimenting with to a book Richard had recently finished. As the evening wore on, there was a lightness between them, a sense of familiarity that neither of them had known could exist. As their dinner drew to a close, Richard found himself glancing down at his hands, gathering his thoughts for something he'd been wanting to say. He took a steadying breath, then looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze with a sincerity that made her expression soften. "Sarah, I know we've come a long way," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know that this relationship, this bond, it's something we're both still learning to understand. But I want you to know how grateful I am for this chance, for the time you've given me. I don't take it for granted." Sarah's eyes glistened, and she took a deep breath, nodding as she reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his hand. "I'm grateful too," she said, her voice steady yet filled with a quiet strength. "For a long time, I didn't think I wanted this. I thought I'd closed that part of my life. But you made it easy to trust again. And I didn't know how much I needed that." They shared a moment of silence, both of them absorbing the quiet intensity of the moment. Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him, a rare feeling that filled the spaces where his grief had once lived. It wasn't that the pain was gone. It had simply transformed, allowing him to love again in ways he'd never thought possible. After dinner, as they walked outside together, the crisp autumn air filled with the scent of leaves and distant wood smoke. Sarah stopped, glancing at him with a gentle smile. "Would you like to come to my apartment?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of nervousness. "I have some things I'd like to show you." Richard agreed, feeling both honored and curious. They took a short walk to her place, a modest, cozy apartment filled with plants, books, and small, carefully arranged details that seemed to capture her essence. He could see her personality in every corner, every piece of art on the wall, and it made him smile to think of her building a life on her own terms. As they settled onto the couch, Sarah reached for a small, well-worn box on her coffee table. She opened it carefully, revealing an assortment of keepsakes, old photos, letters, tiny trinkets that seemed to hold deep meaning. She picked up a small, faded teddy bear, holding it in her hands as if it were a delicate relic. "This was my only toy for a long time," she said, her voice quiet. "I used to imagine it was from my real family, that it had somehow found its way to me. I held on to it because it made me feel connected to something." Richard felt a pang in his heart, his eyes filling with emotion as he watched her cradle the tiny bear. He could see the child she'd once been, longing for a family, searching for meaning in the small things that had given her comfort. He reached over, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of quiet support. "You've been so strong, Sarah," he murmured. "Stronger than I could have ever imagined. I wish I'd been there for you. But I'm here now, and I'll be here as long as you'll have me." She nodded, her expression softening as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a depth of emotion he hadn't seen before. "I know," she whispered, "and I think I'm ready to let you in. I think I want you in my life, for real." A rush of warmth filled Richard's heart, and he gently pulled her into an embrace, holding her as she let out a deep, relieved breath. It felt as though they were finally letting go of the past, surrendering to the love and trust they'd worked so hard to build. As they sat together, the quiet of her apartment filled with the calm acceptance of what they'd become to each other, Richard knew he had found something he thought he'd lost forever. He had found family, he had found healing, and most importantly, he had found a daughter who had been there all along, waiting for this moment as much as he had. The journey hadn't been easy, and they both knew it wouldn't be perfect. But as they held each other, sharing a bond that was as new as it was profound, they felt a peace that words couldn't fully capture. And in that embrace, they both understood that, no matter what came next, they would face it together, as father and daughter, bound by a love that had survived everything.